Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Razdan. Petrol and diesel prices across the country were raised for the 9th consecutive day today, with oil marketing companies passing on the increase in international fuel prices to the consumers. This follows the 20-day price freeze initiated by OMCs before the Karnataka polls. Indian Oil Corporation, the country's largest fuel retailer, has since 14th May increased petrol and diesel prices by over 2 rupees per litre. Petrol and diesel prices in Delhi soared to the highest price recorded in the city's history on Tuesday. Oil Minister Dharmendra Pradhan had on Monday attributed the fuel price hike to production cuts initiated by Organization of Petroleum exporting countries and told the media that the government is working on a solution to provide respite to the consumers. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will discuss what is causing the oil prices to surge and how do we brace for it. Joining me on the program today are Anil, Razdan, former Special Secretary, Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas; Nitin Desai, former Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India; Bhattacharya, Editorial Director of the Business Standard; and Professor Harshvi Pant, Head Strategic Studies, Observer Research Foundation. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Mr. Razdan, let me begin with you. Oil at $80 a barrel internationally. In India, in the national capital, we've seen petrol and diesel prices reach their highest ever mark today. Is it time for us to be concerned?
You're perfectly right. It's time to be concerned because when you are so heavily dependent on a commodity which is imported in such a large measure, and you're also in a situation where you're linked to dollar pricing, it's a double whammy. It's high time that I think we paid serious attention to economy in the use of fuel, and to the extent possible, we should also do ethanol blending, as the government has already announced new schemes.
National biofuel policy.
Biofuel policy. We have to move in that direction and probably hasten also the electric vehicle launch plan and give it a certain roadmap.
You know, but Mr. Razdan, do we have the requisite infrastructure and technology to make the switch?
That's precisely the point, that unless you set a roadmap for yourself, you may not be able to do so in a given time frame.
Sure. Okay.
But you see, when in respect to the petroleum products, we should also keep in mind that there are two issues. One is, you see, if there's only a demand increasing problem, we have adequate exports also of petroleum products which are getting us foreign exchange. But if it's a supply side constraint and a demand and a situation or a crisis arising from there, that in my view presents us with a bigger problem.
Okay. That's a long-term goal as far as we are concerned. What needs to be done immediately? What needs to be done in the short term? Mr. Desai, you know, industry bodies like ASSOCHAM and FICCI have been saying that we should immediately cut excise duty on oil products. Is that the way to go forward to look at the problem that is staring in our faces right now?
I would say that that's a very difficult thing to do, because the impact that that would have on the budget deficit is quite serious. Remember this, that a big part of the improvement that we saw in the fiscal situation after 2014 was because of the fall in oil prices, which fell sharply after 2014 down to in the 40s in 2016. And if we are to try and cut, yes, it is perfectly true that the government took advantage of this and raised excises and reduced the budget deficit. Now, if we are to reverse that and start cutting excises, then I think they'll have a serious problem in meeting the deficit. And the reason I'm stressing this is that there's a second deficit you have to worry about. That's a current account deficit. Today, with these oil prices, you're probably looking at in India needing an inflow to balance the current account deficit of an inflow of close to $75 million. Now, up to $50 million is more or less okay. We can expect it from normal flow of remittances and FDI. But to get 75, And that too in a situation where the US interest rates may also rise, will be a tough call.
Sure.
And if you start modifying your macro situation here, then you'll start running into serious problems in getting that inflow. So I would say that the government has to be very cautious. I realize the political downside of not cutting taxes, but I would say that the downside of cutting it, if it leads to a major balance of payments problem, would be even greater.
Right. You know, Mr. Bhattacharya, talking about the macro economy, is India's macro magic beginning to fade?
Well, I mean, when you see both on the current account deficit front and also the fiscal deficit front, there are new challenges emerging, both because of the oil prices going up and even the government expenditure seems to be straining at the leash, so to say. So definitely the oil bonanza that this government was blessed with from 2014 onwards is beginning to show signs of wearing off. So certainly these are challenges, and therefore I do feel that the excise cut that is being sought by different bodies, as you mentioned, is not the right response, because this situation requires a far more fundamental change in the way these challenges are to be faced. There are three quick points I'd like to make. Number one, do not fall for an easy option to please the voters before you go for elections. Remember,
it's an election year at the end of the day, Mr. Bhattacharya.
Please remember that the 2 rupee increase that you see in the space of 4 or 5 days is because you had imposed an informal freeze on retail prices in the run-up to the Karnataka elections.
But that was expected.
That was expected, but it was the wrong thing to have done. You should have allowed, because if you have decontrolled the prices, let the oil companies take the decision. Let them decide on what should be the price. Because you had imposed an informal freeze on the retail prices, the accumulated impact had to be passed on, and it had to be passed on in one go, and you suddenly see in 3 days prices going up and you see the furore. So therefore, the lesson number one is keep in mind that small doses of increases of 10 paisa, 20 paisa, 30 paisa, 50 paisa per day is something that people can absorb and people get used to it. But you do it in one go, 1 rupee one day on 50 paisa or 75% in one day, and 3 days you consecutively keep raising the prices, you have a problem. Number two, focus on the efficiency of Indian refineries. Indian refineries are one of the worst refineries as far as efficiency is concerned. Believe me that today the wastage element in refinery processing is as high as 9%. Now there is no reason why Indian refineries should continue to remain as inefficient as that. Number three, there is no reason to continue with a policy of trade parity prices on the basis assuming 80% import and 20% export to determine your dealer level prices at which you sell it to the refineries crude oil, because 80-20 trade parity price was an outcome of controlled prices of petrol and diesel. Now that the petrol and diesel have been decontrolled, let the trade parity prices system be dismantled and let true efficiencies come into play, so that the refineries are actually in competition with other refineries to be more efficient and produce that or refine that crude oil in a manner that their cost comes down. Today, all refineries more or less have the same price at which they are selling it to their dealers.
Right.
It is completely a sham, to my mind, of reform in this sector. So the three critical areas of reform that are needed, and they can be implemented in good time, instead of trying to deal a body blow to India's fisc and current account deficit, as Dr. Desai rightly pointed out.
Sure, points taken. You know, let's get into what's really causing this oil price hike on the international market. Professor Pant, is it purely geopolitical, and is Mr. Donald Trump to be blamed with what's happening in Iran and with what's happening in Venezuela?
Well, Venezuela not so much, in Iran yes. So I think what we are looking at the larger geopolitics of oil, which is once again, and we see this every few years, and I think the discussion in India also then tends to become very ad hocism, ad hoc based, because every time there is a geopolitical crisis, we tend to look at India and say, oh my God, prices are rising, what should be done? And then we forget when the prices are down and the reforms take a back seat. So I think the issue here is that what is happening at the larger geopolitical level is something that is out of our hands largely. So what Mr. Trump has done in terms of dealing the body blow to the JCPOA, the Iranian nuclear deal, means that Iran is not going to be able to sell the oil on the global markets, and increasingly will cut back. So I think markets are factoring that in. Similarly, you have a situation, very messy situation in Venezuela, and I think sanctions there are coming. They have not yet come from America. So I think once they come to the fullest, and I think several countries have withdrawn their ambassadors, signals are being sent. America has made it very clear that they're not happy. So I think what we are looking at, as it is, Venezuelan infrastructure was in bad shape. And now that that the signals are going that Venezuela will be hit with sanctions, I think we are going to see again some greater problems in so far as the role of Venezuela. Then I think the other issue that you pointed out about how Saudi-Russian collusion in the oil market has meant how the output has been curtailed. So that output, again, we will see what happens. I think our petroleum minister has talked to the Saudis about it, and they've assured us that they will be doing everything possible. So we should take them at their word that something will be done about it. But I think the larger point here is that the geopolitics around oil is always going to be messy. We are always going to face these problems every few years, and we have not seen the last of it yet. So if you think of West Asia today, it's in such a big chaos that tomorrow, if there is a crisis between Israel and Iran, which seems to be in the offing, which Iran has said that it's going to walk out, it may walk out of the nuclear proliferation treaty itself, and there are so many conflicts brewing, then I think that the situation can get even more complicated. So for us to realize that every time there is a crisis on the global oil market, we'll think of reforms, I think is a misplaced idea in the first place.
Okay, so how do we brace for it, Mr. Razdan? And secondly, is this a strategy by the Trump administration so that the prices rise and its shale producers can come back into the market?
Possibly. You see, there's always a big power game. And I think, as Professor Pant has pointed out, that Russia and the Saudis are also the other big players. If the oil prices go up, you see their economies also start picking up. They've suffered a bit on account of the lowering of the prices. Shale would certainly give an impetus to the United States to go up. But I think, somewhere, if we look back, when the oil prices were low and probably assets abroad were available, the surpluses which could have been garnered within the ONGC to acquire assets abroad, and they went in for expenditure in the domestic front, that possibly was a bus that was missed by ONGC, because as long as you see we have over 80% dependence on imports, our vulnerability is always there, and this is realpolitik. And I think Iran is actually a factor which I would say is a concern to us, because I was frankly looking at a gas pipeline, possibly from Iran to India also, because that is another economy that we were moving towards.
Sure. Correct me if I'm wrong, but since you brought up Iran, I think the oil that Iran produces as well is tailor-made for our refineries here in India. So that's going to be a big blow for us as well, isn't it?
It could be. It could be.
Okay. All right. Taking the discussion forward now, Mr. Desai, there are many, several bodies have called for the states to do something. There are certain sections of society who have said that oil and petroleum products should be brought under the ambit of the GST. But going by what the government has said in the recent past, it seems to be very clear that at least for the time being, petroleum and its products will not be brought under the GST. So should the states also then take a share of this burden and probably reduce taxes at their level?
First, I don't think the tax reduction is a good idea. Certainly, we have a deficit management problem, not just in the center, but also in the states. And I would say that the risk of a serious deterioration in the fiscal and current account deficit situation towards the end of the year, which is what would happen if we were to do what people are asking for now, is an even bigger risk. Remember this, that the petroleum products have a weight of 2.4%. in this consumer price index. So the actual impact on consumer prices, on DRS allowances, is nowhere near as serious as it looks. This is a sticker shock. The problem thing which Bhattacharya mentioned. You delayed it so that the thing went up by 2 rupees instead of going up in small amounts week by week. Let me just comment on one question you asked, Frank, which is the potential, what is the game that the US is playing? You know, even 45 years ago when we had the first oil crisis in 73, some of us argued and some of us believed then that one reason for that was that the US wanted oil prices at a level at which their domestic oil production would remain competitive, A, and B, that any such oil price hike would put money in the hands of regimes which are essentially favorable to them and would lessen their fiscal burden in the security responsibilities they have in West Asia. Maybe that argument holds now also, except this time it's shale which has to become competitive. But anyhow, this is very far-fetched, and Professor Pant is probably in a better position to comment than I would. I would say that you will have to live with the reality that you are dependent on a product which is subject to geopolitical risk. And it so happens that right now most of the oil price hike is because of supply side issues, geopolitical risks. And I don't see any way out. Getting domestic getting concessions abroad does not help you. It's on a concession abroad, you'll get the oil cheaper. What would have helped is if we had been able to find more oil domestically. Our domestic oil production has stagnated around 30-35 million tons for a very long time now. And I think one of the disappointments is that we don't seem to have succeeded in really expanding domestic oil production and domestic gas production.
Sure.
That would help if we were to be able to do that.
Right. All right. Mr. Bhattacharya, you know, petrol and diesel deregulated a few years ago.
Yeah.
Do you think that we need to take a relook at that particular decision, looking at where petrol and diesel are today?
Well, if you are talking about deregulation, I would like to raise the issue about, is it proper deregulation? What has happened is that the oil companies continue to determine the prices in unison. Competition Commission of India does not think it is necessary to look into this issue about 3 or 4 refineries. And if you look at the prices, they're broadly the same. Yes, you have seen daily changes in prices, but they are also the changes happening in unison. Now, what you are seeing as a result of this, this I would call phony deregulation, is that the private sector refineries are having a ball. Now, Mr. Razdan pointed out how this is a great export opportunity, but you will be shocked to know that while oil prices are going up, crude oil prices are going up, at a time an import value is going up, but our exports are not going up. And that is because all our private refineries, which used to be in the big way in the export market, no longer think it necessary to export the products, petrol and diesel. Instead, they are selling it in the domestic market. They actually have seen a huge rise in the number of retail outlets by these private refineries, because they realize that the pricing mechanism which has been created based on improper principles, in my view, is a bonanza for them. So instead of exports going up as a result of crude oil prices going up, exports are not going up at the same pace, but imports are going up, and that is because the refineries are more induced to sell their products in the domestic market. So I think you need genuine pricing reform in the domestic retail market for petrol and diesel, not just saying that I will allow them to revise the prices on a daily basis or on a fortnightly basis. So I think that's the way forward, not this kind of paying lip service to deregulation in the prices.
Sure. Professor Pant, as far as the problem itself is concerned, it's a supply side problem. So do we use our goodwill, do we use our diplomacy, speak to the suppliers and ensure that we get something out of it?
I think we have started doing that to a limited extent, but I think our leverage to sort of shape their policy preferences is quite limited, frankly. So it's not entirely clear to me what we can do, for example, in the Iranian crisis at this point, because we've just heard not only the Americans have walked out of the treaty, but also the U.S. Secretary of State was on national television saying that they're going to impose such sanctions on Iran that they will regret. That the economy will completely collapse. So I think the agenda from Americans is very clear, that Iranian economy has to be crushed properly. From their perspective, it may be in their national interest, but I think the larger implications of this are going to be severe. Similarly, what we have witnessed with regard to what is happening in Venezuela is, again, part of it is Venezuelan internal problem, but part of it is also that the Western world has completely isolated a country which is one of the largest reservoirs of oil. Similarly, what we are witnessing now in the larger Middle East, in the larger West Asian landscape, where I think increasingly this logic of the Arab Gulf states and how they are going to fight the power of Iran is becoming the defining element. So how do we position ourselves there? And I think partly we have done well. We have had great engagements with almost every sector in West Asia. Prime Minister himself has visited almost all major countries and has had great interactions with them. I think the Saudi visit in particular, where Saudi Aramco is now investing in India, I think that has been the idea that we have to quote these countries because they are important for us. And let's also remember that America and the West now do not rely on the Middle Eastern oil. We are the ones that are going to bear the brunt of what happens in that part of the world.
Sure.
So increasingly, I think Chinese and Indians will have to find a way, and I hope that the informal summits that the Prime Minister has been having with his counterpart in China and Russia, talking about this very important part of the world from where we and the Chinese are deriving most of our energy.
That could be a very great area of cooperation going forward as well for India and China. And let's hope we see some forward movement on that front. Closing comments now from all my guests, beginning with you, Mr. Razdan. What are our options going forward?
Well, I think if you talk realistically, being an election year, I honestly feel that there could be a cut in excise duties. Of course, the centre should try and embarrass the states also, who are taking a very large VAT from petroleum. In fact, the irony is that the three sin products that I call, one is oil products, third is coal, second is coal, and the third is liquor. They are the major contributors to the financial coffers of governments. We have to seriously think what we can do in the long run. But the fact remains that as compared to our GDP, the price that we pay for petroleum in India as a measure of a day's wage is among the highest in the world.
Sure.
So the Indian polity will have to be taken care of, and I personally feel that there could be a cut in excise and other duties in the days to come. Of course, the government will have to find a way to do its fiscal management.
Right.
Maybe there could be some effect on some of the other programs, but looking in the long term, because governments, I think, in such critical sectors should look at a longer perspective. I think we have to look at substitutes and move across from over-dependence on oil and look towards some of the other
renewable energy. All right. Mr. Desai, Mr. Razdan was talking about a double whammy, rising fuel, falling rupee. How do we address that problem?
I don't think on the falling rupee you can do much because the two are connected. The rupee is falling because people are withdrawing from India. The FIIs are withdrawing. So two are connected issues, and I would say that you must expect that with the sort of current accounts prospects which confront us, the rupee will continue to decline against the dollar for some more time. So that there's no relief on that front. So my guess is that Mr. Razdan is right. The government, for political reasons, will do a little bit. I suspect that they'll make a small cut, not a big one, and then lean on the states to do a little bit more. My worry is that this will lead them into bigger problems towards the end of the year when they may be confronted by a serious payments crisis.
Sure. Mr. Bhattacharya, I was reading a report in the Hindu earlier today, and it very categorically said, quoting Finance Ministry sources, that the government believes that the oil prices have not crossed the threshold that they are looking at. What do you think is the government's threshold as far as the oil prices are concerned?
My understanding is the threshold is $80 per barrel.
But we're there and thereabout.
Well, but if you look at the India basket crude oil price, it is well below 80. It is, I think, not even crossed 70, 71 right now. So the India basket crude oil price is well within that benchmark of $80 per crude oil per barrel. So I don't see that being a problem, but leaning on states is going to be as dangerous as leaning on the center to reduce excise duty. Because just give you one set of quick numbers, 16% of the state's combined own tax revenues is coming from the oil products. Whereas for the center, it is almost 30% of the entire indirect taxes comes from petroleum products. So therefore, in my view, it will probably center will have to take a larger cut, and 1 rupee fall in duties will actually make the center poorer by 13,000 crore rupees. So if it is going to be a 2 rupee decline in the excise rate for the petrol or diesel, then the government is actually is poorer by 26,000 crore rupees, which is almost 0.4% of GDP. So these are the numbers, and these are scary numbers.
Yeah, they are.
In a year, and my fear is that the government may forego its fiscal deficit obligations in some way, but at the end of the year, they still have, after the elections, 3 state elections are over, they may, who knows, they might try to recoup that loss by tinkering with the direct taxes rate, which will take effect from April, not unlike indirect taxes, which take effect from the day you announce it.
We announced it,
so,
yeah, sure.
So that is a possibility.
Professor, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
Well, I would think that most serious analysis of the oil prices that I have seen also suggests that while the news is bad, I think prices are going to come down eventually. But the thing is, from India's perspective, I hope that this is a time when we can almost frame a long-term response to this problem, because we don't want to be in a situation every time there is a hike in the prices, a policy discussion ensues about what to do, because we, as I think was pointed out earlier, you need fundamental reforms in the sector, and unless you make those fundamental reforms now, you are going to continue to live with this problem forever.
Right. All right. On that note, then, we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective. For us, what's coming out of this debate is the fact that we need to look at this problem in the long term. We cannot look for short-term fixes, and it's an issue that needs to be addressed at the earliest. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. See you again next time.